Got it. We are now live on the What's on an Elephant and Castle Facebook page. It's been a couple of weeks, folks. I'm back. I'm feeling a little bit better. I've had a rough time over the last couple of weeks, but hip surgery has gone well, and I'm getting back into things. And I've been looking forward to speaking with this woman who's joining us today, Isabela Miranda Gomez, who comes from LAWRS, which is the Latin American Women's Rights Society Services, based here in London. And very particular being is that the Elephant and Castle has a very large Latin community. And I think, Isabela, just as we were speaking about today, what we want to try to do is be able to tell you exactly what you do, the services you provide, and we'll go from there. I'm hoping I can go the full 45 minutes, but I might tap out after 30. But thank you for joining me, Isabela. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me today here, Nick. I think I speak on behalf of everyone that followed the program, that we are really happy to have you back, and we are happy that all went well with the surgery. Yeah, very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Can you tell the community, who you are and what you do at LAWRS?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Isabela. I'm Latin American migrant woman from Brazil, currently living in the UK. This is where I find my home now, where I have been living for a couple of years now. And I'm currently the service manager for the Violence Against Women and Girls team at LAWRS.
Isabela, I think we did mention that this is obviously, it's a subject that can be quite, it can be quite heavy. And I think that I'm very interested to know, your background. How I noted that you have a background in law, but how did you get involved in LAWRS? What's your story? How from kind of when it all began to where it is today?
Ooh, that's such an interesting question. Actually, when I was in Brazil, so when I did my law degree, got my law degree in Brazil. And when you're finishing the course, it's a 5 years course, you have to write a dissertation. And I somehow was a bit bothered by domestic abuse. I was a bit bothered by the way that it was approached by society in general. I was a bit bothered with the question that normally people ask, which is ask the survivors, which is why haven't you left? Why didn't you leave earlier? Why did you wait so long? And I was reflecting on that, on thinking, maybe we shouldn't ask that question to a survivor. Maybe we should start questioning the perpetrators. Why have they continued to abuse survivors for so long? And I was also thinking, maybe if they hadn't left before, maybe it's because it's hard. So I wanted to investigate a little bit more, because I wanted us as a society to treat this phenomenon with a bit more, it's not even empathy, but it's a bit of more knowledge, and not like the harmful common sense of asking harmful questions or saying harmful things and just judging the survivors, not really understanding what they have been through. So that's how I started getting involved with domestic violence. Then I moved to the UK. At the beginning, I worked in a refugee organization. So I would work with refugee, asylum seekers, and vulnerable migrants. And that's when I started looking at it from a different perspective. And I started thinking about the Latin American community, because for Latin American women who are living here in the UK and are survivors of domestic abuse, of sexual violence, I started looking at this intersection of being a survivor of a gender-based abuse, but also being a migrant woman, and all the overlap layers of barriers and discrimination that they have to face. So that's what brought me to LAWRS. I wanted to work not only with vulnerable migrants, but also wanted to work with the community.
Wow, thank you so much for showing up. I kind of wish you didn't have a job. It's something that, as we mentioned before, I mean, domestic violence is part of my story, is part of my life. I've seen it from a very young age to probably, Isabela, not one woman I know not having experienced some kind of, whether it's domestic violence or at least, violence on the street or some kind of sexual harassment. And I think we did mention kind of the societal problem of patriarchy, and it's kind of really hard for people to say if they don't see it. You know, I work with a lot of people who are like, oh, it's not that bad, it's not that bad. But normally they sit in a white-bodied male frame that, you know, so they don't see it because it's not part of their lives. They don't feel threatened in any way. Like, as we go along, and as domestic violence is, and you know, again, it happens towards women, it happens towards men. What do you think are the things that people need to start to recognize when, like, it's very interesting that you talk about the kind of idea of, like, people say, why didn't you leave earlier? And it makes me think about the psychological effects about coercive and controlling behaviors, gaslighting. I know you're not a psychologist, but can you kind of describe a little bit about, you know, what those behaviors look like, you know, so people can maybe start flagging that? Like, if they're starting seeing people, like, you know, for me, gaslighting was described as even something like, you know, when you arrange to meet somebody at 6:30 and you're there at 6:30 and they show up at 7:30, and they convince you that you had arranged it to be 7:30. So you start to question your own kind of like timekeeping abilities. And this is a kind of like I say, it's something that people were starting to indicate with me, with people who start to kind of lie to convince you about your own sanity. Yeah. So can you briefly kind of describe a little bit about coercive controlling behavior, narcissistic tendencies, and gaslighting?
Yeah. Oh, wow, Nick, you brought so much with your comment. I was trying to make notes here because you brought so many valuable things that I think we should touch on. First of all, I'm really sorry for the people that you have known that have gone through domestic abuse. We know how hard it is. And if they have mentioned that to you, if they have disclosed that to you, I'm sure it's because they felt safe talking to you about that. So that says a lot. Second thing that reminded me of one thing that I heard when I moved to this country, actually, because I was talking to someone and I said that, well, I have this background in law and I, you know, used to study about domestic abuse. I work with survivors, and they said, oh, but that's because you come from Brazil. That doesn't happen here. And I said, oh, wow, I thought this was, you know, sort of like a worldwide issue. Not particularly sure why it wouldn't happen in the UK, but I very soon find out that this person was actually, unfortunately, completely wrong, because here in this country, 1 in 4 women will be victims of a gender-based violence. And we know that every week, 2 women lose their lives because of gender-based violence here in the UK. So it's about having that awareness and how important it is. But then there's also something that you mentioned, that they don't see it. Some people don't see it. And then you said they don't feel threatened by it. So I think that's a huge difference between don't seeing it, which I find it very difficult because it's literally happening everywhere. It's happening around us. It either has happened to us or has happened to someone that we know, or we've seen it on TV. So it's hard not to see what's happening, but very different from seeing is actually realizing what's happening and what is our responsibility with this, you know. So I think the fact that some people don't feel threatened by it, then perhaps it's the explanation of why they don't pay attention, why they don't try to look at this from a more trauma-informed approach, which was what you're sort of bringing on your question. But I thought it would be important to you know, bring those numbers here, because it's actually here, it is happening. And if we pay attention to it, we will see what's happening. We hear about it, we have experienced it ourselves. But when we don't feel threatened, then, you know, perhaps it's not something that we would care about, or we would try to change it, right? So that was one point. The second point is about the impact of domestic abuse. So when we talk about domestic abuse, we talk a lot about re-victimization and re-traumatization, and how do we avoid that? So as a society in general, I think we do have a role to play on that. So for instance, when someone discloses domestic abuse to you, try not to be judgmental, try not to find easy way out, because, you know, there's not really an easy way out. If someone has trusted you enough to talk to you about that, just be there for that person. Share some relevant numbers where this person can go for help. Don't try to understand. Don't try to put yourself on someone else's shoes, because you know what, that's not possible. I remember when I started working with domestic abuse, I was obviously really impacted by everything that I was seeing and working with. And then I told my supervisor, you know, and I said, I don't know what I would do if I was in her situation. This is just so difficult. And then she stopped me right there. She said, but you're not in her situation. You're not her. And she could be much stronger than you are. She could be much more resourceful than you are. And she has coping with this. She has survived. So don't put yourself in her shoes, because you could actually be limiting someone when you do that. And I thought that was very interesting. And I do have lots of respect when I'm working with survivors, and I have the respect to understand that they are the expert in their experience. They have survived so far. So we have lots to learn from them. So I think it's everyone can play a role in this, you know, society that we live. And one of our roles can be, don't be judgmental. It's already a significant, you know, start. Try to understand this a little bit more. And what I want to say is that even though this is a difficult topic, this is a hard subject, like we were talking before, we are talking about survivors. We are talking about women that, you know, can leave this experience behind, can cope with what's happening, can still have a brilliant future in a brilliant life. So I think it's our responsibility just to be there for them and make sure we have the correct information to pass on that information. Another thing that is really relevant is that sometimes when someone talks to a friend, or, you know, and says that what they are going through, and the friends say, just leave him. What you're doing with that, just leave him. And actually leaving a perpetrator can be a very dangerous time on the woman pathway towards safety and justice. So I wouldn't recommend someone just to do anything. You know, it's always best if they go to a specialist organization, to a women's organization, where they can talk to a professional, to have a proper plan, a safety plan, to do that, to do whatever they want to do, but do that in a safe way. There's also misconception about the role that organization can play as someone's life. So we are not there. We work specifically with Latin American women, but there are organizations who works with other communities who are by and for organizations, which means, for instance, we are a Latin American woman by Latin American woman working for Latin American women, but and there are other specific specialized organizations, but our role is not there to tell someone what they should do. They know best about their lives. Who am I to tell them what they should do, when they should do, you know, what's best for their lives? We are there to listen to them, to validate their experience, and to do a plan, whatever they want to do. It's about giving someone the tools so they can make an informed decisions. And when they make those decisions, they do that also in a safe way. So sometimes I see that some women take so long to search for help, to search for an organization, because they are afraid that whenever they do that, they will be forced to leave the abusive relationship, or they will be told what to do, or they will be judged. That's not our role. We are not there for that. We are there to really welcome them. It's about showing tools. It's about sharing information. It's about providing support. So I just thought it would be good to clarify that. And another very interesting thing that you brought is the idea of coercive control, which is now a crime under the Domestic Abuse Act, and the idea of gaslighting. And I think gaslighting can be so subtle, and because it's so subtle, but yet so powerful, it's difficult to understand that it's actually happening. And then sometimes women tell us, but is this just happening in my mind, or is this really happening? Because it's what you said, isn't it? You start questioning yourself. Someone is manipulating you in such a a subtle way, but yet powerful way, that you start questioning yourself. You start questioning if that really happened or not. So it's another thing for us to keep an eye on. But if you're feeling unsettled, if you're feeling that there's something wrong, then ask, go to this specialist organization, talk to someone so you can know a bit more about this, know what gaslight is, know about emotional abuse, about psychological abuse, to try to understand what's happening with you so you can make a proper decision.
Thank you for all of that. I have a few questions come to mind. Well, okay, first of all, I'll go back to the bit where you were talking about, that a person is the expert in their own trauma and their own experiences, and that you are learning from them, from the people that you are working with. I'm interested to know that in your time, what's the evolution of your learnings from women who are experiencing domestic violence? And then, okay, we'll leave it at that. Let's just go with that, and then I've got a follow-on question on that one.
Thank you, Nick. I think when we say that women are the expert on their experience, we say that we cannot interfere on someone's pathway because they know what's best for their life. They have been able to cope with that situation. They have been able to survive that situation. And whenever we come from the outside and we try to interfere, we will actually cause we say that we will cause an unbalanced situation, because domestic abuse, when we are talking about domestic abuse, we are talking about a choice from the perpetrator. We are talking about power. We are talking about control. The perpetrator are trying to control the survivors in a certain way. And if we come and interfere on that balance, we will change the dynamic of power. And we don't know what the perpetrator might do to try to continue that, keep that balance. I don't know if that makes sense. That's one of the reasons that we say that leaving an abusive relationship can be a dangerous time, because when a survivor leaves that abusive relationship, she's changing.
Escalation
she's changing everything. And then one of the things the perpetrator can do is escalate the abuse, escalate the violence to try to maintain that sort of control. So each survivor has a very individual pathway. There's not one should fit all. There's not just one solution for everyone. It depends on the journey that they are, what moment of the journey that they are. So when we work with someone, we can't come with, a set plan. This is going to be the safety plan. This is going to be the action plan. And this is what we have for you. For every survivor that comes to our service, we build that with them, because it's going to be different for everyone. We have unique lives, we have unique experience. And in that sense that, the survivor is the expert there, we are there to learn with them. So if we want to, provide information, to give them tools, we have to understand what is their journey, what moment of their journey they are, what is it that they want from us, and then we'll build that together.
The other thing that you mentioned is when women when women get to a point where they can start to perhaps say, questioning, what's going on in their domestic life, and they want to get help. I noticed that on your website, you have the crash exit button. And I imagine that's for safety, when just in case somebody is looking over your shoulder, you can exit the site quickly, right?
Yeah.
So what about when someone is so controlling that you're even scared to have access to your phone? I've heard of cases of some women who, are not allowed to go to their GP, without their partner following them, getting a haircut without their, so they never ever get that chance to even interact with a postman, because they're constantly being watched upon by the perpetrator. So I know this is a very difficult question to answer, but if somebody's there and they know that you exist, but they can't get to you, I imagine that is the big conundrum for any services like you. But what are the things that you think are being developed, or that you are obviously conscious of, when literally some women can never, can't look at their phone without somebody looking over their shoulders?
This is something that we saw happening a bit more intensified during the pandemic and the first lockdown, didn't we? So we saw not necessarily an increase on domestic abuse. Domestic abuse was already there, perhaps an escalation of the abuse and an impact on the coping mechanisms that survivors used to have, but then the coping mechanisms were just gone. So we saw that at the beginning, there was an increase on the number of calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, but actually services like ours, we saw an immediate decrease of people coming to our services just because they were trapped at home and they were still trying to figure out how is it that they're going to escape from the perpetrators that were constantly with them. And then when the first lockdown eased, we saw then a quick increase to the access to the service, and we saw an increase in the complexity of the cases as well, because the women were trapped, no more coping mechanisms in place. It was just too unbearable to be in that kind of situation. And I know you're coming from a point of view that a lot of women are still trapped in relationships like that because perpetrators can hack their mobile phones, they can have access to their emails, to their conversations, and so on. I think for a survivor, it's good to be aware of what sort of support that it will be available around her. So each survivor has obviously a different life and different routine that they might have. So if they go to the GP, that's why it's so important that the professionals are aware of that and not always see people coupled together. It's important that when they go to the GPs, the professional, the GP actually ask to have an appointment only with the woman, separated from a man, because they need to investigate what's going on there. But I think from the survivors, there were a lot of sort of tools out there, that places that they could go and ask for help, or they would have a minute away from the perpetrator. It would be the moment that they would be able to contact other organizations. So I think it's about the woman being aware of this, trying to find out, trying to talk to friends that they can trust, if they can trust the neighbors as well, trying to make the neighbors aware of what's going on. But again, it depends on the survivors, and I'm just aware that we are talking, and then anybody can hear also what we are talking here. So I don't want to give away all the tools that we use to actually be in touch with survivors, because we don't want everybody to be aware of that. But I think the survivors, just make sure you look around, look at places that you can go, that it's safe, and in those places you can actually disclose something, and they will direct you to an organization. But it's taking those moments of opportunities that we know the survivors can do it. There are women who are in harder situations that it's hard to reach, but you would be surprised of how the survivors can actually be so resourceful and take those opportunities to ask for help.
So I think again, some of the things that I've heard along my journey and listening to women and their stories of surviving is that a lot of the things, well, not a lot, I've heard a few times about their inability to believe in the system to protect them. So, I mean, I don't even want to get into the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing, but, we're seeing these court cases, around the world, broadcasts around the world about, a woman who's had proven domestic violence against her, and her actually being made out to be the bad person in this. And again, I think it's just kind of the systemic problem around society and patriarchy that is wrong there. So I think that a lot of people that, might be thinking, or a question that people might be thinking is, yeah, well, when I get out, will I be safe? Will the courts be able to back me up? What are the legalities around it now? Are they becoming better protected for the survivor of domestic violence, or is it still this kind of thing of like, oh, he was on medication, all the excuses, that they can come up with, and then them not actually, or them not being believed. So what would your comments around that be?
I think you're bringing a very good reflection for us all that are watching this conversation, right, Nick? Because I think, again, we all can play a role in that. We don't want to live in a society where, perpetrators are not responsible for their actions, do we? So I think we as individuals can make changes in that when we start reflecting on, is it exactly right? What's happening when we start questioning ourselves, when we start questioning our own behavior, so we can change. So that's one thing. In a professional way, I think that's the importance of organizations like LAWRS or women's organizations, buying for organizations, because we will believe the survivor. This is a safe space for the survivor where she will be believed, and that makes a difference. And a lot of our work is actually advocacy work. A lot of our work is to advocate so the woman can access something that is her right as a survivor. A lot of our work is actually, if the woman wants to report, not all the survivors want to report the perpetrator to the police. If they do want to report, is to make sure that the police, respect the victim's code, treat the victim, the survivor, with dignity, investigate the case appropriately, and so on and so forth. So it is true, we still live in this world, don't we? But we are changing it. And something that you asked before about what I have learned from the survivors is actually their power to change it. Because okay, we do a lot of work in the organization that we work with. We want the system to change, but really, people who are changing the world are the survivors. And it's just amazing the power that they have to change their situation and therefore influence their children, influence their people around them, and little by little change this all myths and beliefs that we still have around gender-based violence. But yeah.
I know that from the small experience that I've had with family court over here, that the courts tend to want to make sure that the family can stay together, so that there is a father and a mother. Mm-hmm. So if a woman is a survivor of domestic violence, has children as her primary concern and security, does make the moves to be able to, to get safe, but then knowing that a court system will somehow want them to be a family, because that's kind of what family courts are all about with regards to custody and I believe there is no actual child custody laws here. I think that there's primary carers, and so that's the other thing that I'm thinking about too, is like, she's obviously, the person has left with the but what about further down the line, if they're scared that maybe the courts are going to want to say visitation rights, children visiting their father, etc. That might bring up a lot of fear with some survivors.
That does bring a lot of fear. And I think that is still a challenge in this country. Family courts are still a challenge in this country. That's why it's so important that the survivors will be assisted by a specialist organization, by a solicitor, a barrister that is well informed about domestic abuse. So we can raise all those concerns in the family courts. But what came to my mind when you were asking this question is that we did used to believe, didn't we, that what's best for the children is to have their both parents together in the same house, and just have the support from those parents. We had this image of a very happy family, and that's what's best for the children. But actually, if there is domestic abuse happening within the house, the child is automatically being impacted by it. Sometimes the woman, they think they are protecting the children by staying in that relationship, and they think that it's enough to send a child to a room and lock the door so she can face the abuse by herself. The child can hear what's going on, even if they can hear because they put headphones, because that's stressful. They would perceive the fear on the mom's behavior. They will feel what the mom is feeling. So it's very difficult not to be impacted by that situation. So I think nowadays we are starting to learn that actually a perpetrator that is an abuser, a partner that is an abuser, it is a father that is an abuser. The best for the children is for the moms, for the mothers to be safe. Because if they are not safe, the child can perceive that happening with the mom. And how would they react to that situation? And they are sometimes put in a difficult situations where they have to choose who to believe, choose who to protect. They feel responsible for what's going on. And when there is physical abuse happening in the house, even if it's just towards the mother, it might be that it could escalate and actually happen towards the child. And also the child might sometimes want to protect the mother and get in front of her in eventual situation with the perpetrator. So all those things, because moms, they do everything they can to protect their children, and they make decisions based on trying to get their child as safe as possible. But it's about us all having this awareness that what is good for the child is for the mom to be safe.
So that brings me into now, let's say somebody has reached out to you and they're resilient and they're ready to make the moves. I know you said every case is an individual, but what does a process look like for somebody who has come to you and asked for help?
Every case it is different. So what it will come out from that initial appointment, it depends on the priority and the needs of the survivor. But in general, we always try to find a safe time to connect with the survivor. So that's really important, that she's safe while she's speaking with us. We try to assess the risk. It's important for us to identify if this is a standard risk, a medium risk, or a high risk. A high risk meaning that at any moment, something could happen, actually. Medium risk, more or less, meaning that something could trigger the perpetrator and then something could happen. So it's important for us to be aware of what's going on. We always have a conversation with the survivor about domestic abuse, about the dynamics of domestic abuse, about how this is not her fault. You would be surprised to see and hear over and over again the survivors thinking that it's their fault, thinking that they could have done something differently and then have prevented that, feeling responsible for the perpetrator, feeling responsible for what's going to happen with the perpetrator, whilst perpetrator, they would never feel responsible for the survivor. If they could send the survivor to jail, they would do that. And a lot of times the survivor tried to protect the perpetrator just because of feeling, responsible for the family. Anyway, so we talk about her needs. We go through her needs. What is it that she wants? What she wants from us at this moment. And then we have an action plan, a safety plan, but we do this holistically. Well, we say that LAWRS, we have this holistic approach. What does that mean actually? It means that when a survivor comes to us, it might not just, there is a situation of domestic abuse, but there are a lot of things involved. One of the things being the children. So she will want to know what are her parental rights and responsibilities. Can she separate from the perpetrator? Can she leave the house with her children? What will be the consequences? And perhaps before making that decision, she will want to have an appointment with a family solicitor to be better well informed. She might be here on a spouse visa, for instance, and then she has the perpetrator telling her that if she ever leave him, he will report her to immigration, get her deported, take the child, and she will go back to Latin America and leave her child behind, which is always something that they are so afraid of. And perpetrators use that to manipulate the survivor. So we would connect them with an immigration solicitor so they can find out about their rights, and they do have rights here. It's about having access to benefits or not, what kind of support they need, if they need counseling, if they need employment rights, because eventually they will need to change employers to be in a safer situation, if they need a refuge. So it's about what they need. That's what I'm saying. It's so individual. But that first appointment is to assess the risk, to talk about what is it that they need, what are their priorities, and make sure they have a safety plan. So whatever decision that they make, they will do that in a safe way as possible.
I think that's amazing. And I know we've been talking for a little over half an hour right now, but again, about a very, very heavy subject. Mm-hmm. Isabela, the one thing I know about survivors, I might tear up, hold on.
Take your time.
Is the resiliency.
Yeah.
The resiliency in them, and the people who've been through it and have come through the other side have made lives for themselves.
Yeah.
And I want to, I want to try to give people some hope. Can you kind of talk about maybe some of the cases that you've known with obviously discretion, but some of the people that you've worked with who've come through this, you know, again, with this resiliency and being able to survive and thrive.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think it is a really emotional and really powerful what you said about the resilience of a survivor. I think when we talk about domestic abuse, it is a difficult topic. It is a complex topic because it's so close to us as well. But it can also be a happy topic when we talk about the survivor's point of view, how they're able to overcome that, how they're able to overcome that trauma, how they're able to overcome that abuse with whatever power they have, and to be on the other side. You know, I think when I look at a survivor, and we have a peer support group at LAWRS, and every session that I have with them, I'm just amazed. Like the lightness that they bring in such a situation that we would think is such a heavy situation, such a dark situation, but they bring light, they bring joy, because they are in that moment on that journey where they are leaving this behind, where they are learning to cope with everything that happened. We have a lot of stories at LAWRS that show that it's also so powerful for us. What is hard for us to see is that some women that come to our service and that they disengage for whatever reason, and they believe that the perpetrator will change, they will not. And then they come back 1 year later in a much more difficult situation. I think that's always heartbreaking for us. But we will be here for them whenever they're ready to engage. But when we see those women, you know, with the power of information, with the tools that they need, going on with their lives on their pace as well. I think there is a lot of our expectations, but this is not about us. I think when we remember about the job, it's not about us, it's about them. It's about what they are going to do with those tools. Not necessarily they are going to decide to leave the perpetrator now or leave the abusive behavior, but now they have tools to deal with that situation. They know how to call 999 should they need to. Some women come to our service not even know how to call the police. But we do have cases of a woman who came to our service. She had reached out for support from social service because her child was being abused as well, from the police. And they only looked her, she was undocumented back then, and they only looked her as an undocumented migrant. They forgot to see that there was a woman, there was a family there, living a horrible situation and asking for help. And their only plan was to share her information with Home Office and get her deported, forgetting to see the whole picture. And then she came to LAWRS. We were able to help her to get away from that house so she and her child could be safe. We liaise with a community care solicitor to challenge social service. We liaise with a family solicitor. We liaise with an immigration solicitor. And we found out that was actually a route for her and for her child to be documented here in this country, which nobody cared to look at. And then nowadays, 1 year later, she's here with status in this country. She has a visa. Her child has a visa as well. She's organizing her life. Her child is starting over. So it's about those messages that sometimes women feel so trapped, and a woman can feel trapped not only physically because the perpetrator is around, but because of so many misinformation. She thinks that there is not a way out. So for those cases, I would always advise, come and talk to us, talk to a specialist or organization. You know, perhaps it's too much for you to see and realize right now, but there might be other options right there. And I do appreciate that it can be difficult if you're a migrant woman here, if you don't speak the language, if you don't know how the system works, you don't know your rights, and you have that perpetrator telling you wrong information all the time. So I think information is power. Come to us, come to a specialist organization to have access to information, to know your rights, and get support so you can make an informed decisions. We see life changings every day. And I think that's what makes our work so, I don't know, special, but so powerful. You know, like I said, we are working with survivors. We are working with very powerful women.
Oh, well, thank you for joining me. I know you weren't nervous at all. You're absolutely amazing. And what you're doing is amazing. I wish you didn't have to be there, but thank you for being there for the women and the survivors that you are there for. If anybody needs to reach out to you, is it just through the website? Should I just put that link into the Facebook feed?
Yeah, I think that would be good to leave the website. They can call our helpline. They could also send an email to referrals@lawrs.org.uk.
Okay.
But perhaps we can put that in writing so it's easier for people to reach out.
Yeah.
We could also leave a line for men who are perpetrators and perhaps want to, you know, not be perpetrators anymore, change their behaviors, take this responsibility. There is an organization that helps with that. And there's the National Domestic Abuse Organization as well. Perhaps we could leave all this information. Yes. I think it's about getting the information, knowing that you won't be judged in whatever it is that you are feeling, you know.
Yeah. I think that's very important. If you actually just send me anything via email, and I'll put it into the Facebook feed. So thank you for joining me today, Isabela. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Nick, for having us, and thanks everyone for participating and watching this conversation.
Yes, thanks everybody for joining us. Again, it was a pretty heavy subject, so we'll make sure that any resources that you may need are going to be put into the Facebook feed. So please reach out if anything that we spoke about today is resonating with your life. As Isabela said, either as a survivor or even as a perpetrator, because at the end of the day, we need to get to the problem and solve the problem so that these services no longer need to be available one day. So again, thank you everybody for joining me. I'll be around on Thursday at 11 a.m. for a Tough Through Tender gathering. Until then, see you all later. Thanks again, Isabela.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Nick.
Bye.